Nick Winter has what's called the 120-hour work week. Okay. And so in comparison, I actually feel like
you're a slacker.
I'm a slacker. Yes, correct. So he streamed his entire work week, and he has it up on his website. This was all coding, so he was in the zone. And I think that flow states are pretty special. And if what you're doing is like flow state style activity, then it's not really that quote unquote painful to work a 100-hour work week. You are just obsessively acting in a direction that you really care about.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Scientist Show. Today, we have Jeremy Nixon. Jeremy is a machine learning researcher, software engineer, and startup founder. Previously, he worked on deep learning at Google Brain. Now, he's the co-founder and CEO of Omni, building an immersive information retrieval system for you and your team. He studied applied math at Harvard University. Today, we'll talk about how he got into Google Brain, his 3-month self-learning plan to learn machine learning, his thoughts and experience on 100-hour work week, and how he executed his goal relentlessly since 2016. If you enjoy the show, you can do a very small thing to help me keep it going by subscribe to the channel, leave a comment if you're on YouTube, or give me a 5-star review. Welcome to the show, Jeremy.
Absolute joy to be in touch. And so hopefully, we can create a new understanding of what's possible for the potential data scientists that listen in and also can explore some ideas, very creative and experimental ideas, and how to work, how to learn, and how to create.
Thank you. So let's get started. Your project was noticed by Jeff Dean, the SVP of Research and AI. Later, you joined Google Brain. Was this a coincidence that got you into ML research in Google Brain?
Not coincidental in the least. So actually, I am a huge fan of planning.
Yeah.
I create long-term overarching plans, and it's actually shocking just how much your identity and self-concept can be restructured by clearly setting out what you intend for yourself. In 2016, I wrote this 5-page document, and it described exactly what sort of 4 qualifications would be required to get into what I conceived of as the elite machine learning research orgs. And so at the time, OpenAI, FAIR, Google Brain, DeepMind, and MSRAI. And these organizations, in my mind, were accessible to someone who didn't necessarily have a PhD, but who had proved through implementing relatively complex deep learning related systems that they were capable of research. And so I set out a project to build what's called SparkDL, this distributed deep learning library in Spark, written by me from scratch before TensorFlow was released. Mm-hmm. So actually back in the day when you had to sort of crawl through cafe blogs and sort of scrape together knowledge from the deep learning textbook in order to implement algorithms like AdaProp and Adam and make sure that you implement your deltas appropriately. And so actually, I took on this huge project as a part of a very intentional long-term plan to position myself to be able to create new research organizations and really institutions that push the limits of machine intelligence and human intellectual capacity through technology.
Yeah. And when you were at Google, what was your plan to get into Google Brain?
So SparkDL was implemented actually at the Spark Technology Center. Mm-hmm. So this is before I got into Google, but it did get Google's attention.
Yeah.
And I remember my manager actually when I walked in to the Spark Technology Center had a really low concept of what I would be capable of. He gave me a project that he intended me to work on for the entire year that I estimated would take maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. And I had someone where I was working with at the time, and I implemented all of the machine learning algorithms that they had intended me to work with. And most of these were wrappers, so it was an R wrapper, but basically the project was completed quite quickly, and I spent the rest of my time somewhat surreptitiously working on my true agenda, which was getting a number of these really substantive new deep learning algorithms into this sort of Spark library, so that we could do state-of-the-art computer vision. And the experience of not being believed in is, I think, a common experience where it challenges you in that you think you're capable of a complex implementation and they think you're not, or they don't think that you can get something into an important open source project. And I got, not only did I get some of these algorithms in, but I was giving presentations at the conferences that they were attempting to get into on work that I was doing like sort of my own accord. And it made it really clear to me that my conception of what I'm capable of is what's going to drive decisions. And I guess sort of created a broader skepticism that I should limit myself to the conceptions of what my coworkers and colleagues think is worthwhile.
And so for around that time, there wasn't a lot of, say, PyTorch. I guess it wasn't as popular as today, so you implemented everything from scratch.
Yeah, so this is 2.5 years before PyTorch was released. And it's really actually quite complex to implement the gradient computations for this very high dimensional body. And so what I actually ended up doing was doing a full implementation in raw NumPy and then converting the implementation to Scala after the fact, because it's just much easier to debug and see and understand of the operations in NumPy. And it came off of a history of basically taking content from textbooks. So the Elements of Statistical Learning is a textbook where I implement a number of the algorithms inside it from scratch in preparation for getting this role. Implementing random forests with decision trees and its Gini coefficient decision criterion, implementing linear models in the sort of GLM framework with all of the link criterion, implementing gradient boosted decision trees and sort of understanding the reweighting that goes into a lot of the decision making, and certainly like linear and logistic regression and the optimizer variance on them, right? Normal form equations, sure, but also gradient descent, Newton's method, the whole 9 yards. Basically taking textbooks, going through their contents in detail, rewriting them in my own words, and then implementing the algorithms that I had read about. Because a lot of the rewriting guarantees that I understand the content, and the algorithm implementation also puts a very strong forcing function on my understanding of the content, where ambiguities in the textbook and also ambiguities in my understanding are made really visceral and clear, and where my implementation fails. And often I'd be banging my head against the wall for days trying to get these implementations to work properly. So basically that journey though convinced me when I joined the Spark Technology Center that I could implement these algorithms. And even though they were brand new, right, even though it felt like convolutional neural networks had very few implementations that were legible. I will say the cafe implementation was barely legible to me at the time. Given months and months of very determined and pained effort, I would get it done. So you learned machine learning through your own plan of self-learning, and implementing textbooks and algorithm, like you mentioned, was part of it. So can you tell us more about your 3-month plan? Yeah, absolutely. There's a few people in my history who were really inspirational. So my senior year at Harvard, I met Vincent Lee, and he told me this story of teaching himself statistics and probability through the full undergraduate curriculum during his freshman summer. And he laid out in detail the texts that he read and the exercises that he did. And he started taking PhD level courses as a sophomore when the rest of Harvard college students were sort of doing standard curriculum. And so it became clear to me that I had dramatically underperformed relative to my potential, because he taught me a lesson that in many ways I already knew. When I was deciding which college to go to, I had tons of options because I had self-studied half a dozen AP tests. And even the ones that I had classes for, I would read the textbook. So there's a textbook in AP US history called An American Pageant. And I loved this book to death. I read it over and over again and ended up in part whenever the teacher had some confusion about the content, filling it in and making corrections all the time. And so it was clear that by reading, I could not only internalize the content at a very deep level, but feel freedom and being an autodidact and be capable of basically moving into whatever industry I thought was worthwhile, teaching myself the content through disciplined practice, and then being able to execute really effectively because I'm using much more knowledge than often people who are studying it in the official ways have access to.
Right.
And so after I met Vincent, there was this sort of lurking sense that I should set out a strong curriculum for myself. And then I read an incredible sequence by Nate Soares, who was also a Google engineer at the time, but taught himself a lot of model theory and mathematics relevant to getting into MIRI, a machine intelligence research org, by studying in all the time he wasn't working. So he would study some like 40 or 50 hours a week while having his Google engineering job, and then pivoted to a different career in his case. And he ended up leading that organization. And following the details of his psychological mechanics and like the processes that he used to read and check himself also convinced me that it was possible. So when I set out my plan, textbook by textbook, I started in a very basic way with Learn Python the hard way, into sort of basic data science and I guess an introduction to data analysis, which covered NumPy and pandas. So I started off from the bottom in some senses, right? I'd studied mathematics, but I actually really needed to learn the basics. And then I read an introduction to statistical learning with applications in R, as well as applied predictive modeling. Very high-level books about what machine learning algorithms exist and in what contexts they're useful. And as soon as I got to implementation, so again, the elements of statistical learning has a lot of implementation detail level content. I was excited because I finally got to actually exercise all of these learnings in a very practical code heavy context. And so it really was this textbook progression as well as the process of rewriting the textbook in my own words, where I read a page and I would reconstruct the page in a Google Doc that I was writing. And a lot of these docs become 100-page documents, right, describing all of the ideas in the book in your own words. But it forces me to remember what I've read at least once. And in the case where you've written it, you usually have your own mental representation that's at play, and you can start to be creative with it. And one of the really beautiful things about implementing these algorithms from scratch is that implementing creative versions of it is totally up to you. You can say, oh, well, k-means happens to work in this way, but what if I adjust the responsibilities or the assignments to cluster centers in a continuous way, where it's an exponentially weighted moving average of the mean instead of jumping them. You can just basically start having ideas, and you often end up reinventing algorithms. So I ran an ML hackathon for inventing new algorithms, and my friend Lin Chuanzeng and I accidentally reinvented a version of hierarchical k-means clustering. And we called it contagion. It was about the way that data would belong to a cluster, and the clusters would grow in a way that was akin to viruses spreading. But it turned out to be single linkage hierarchical agglomerative clustering, and we didn't know at the time, but it was a very cool clustering algorithm. So I think the creativity element's also accessible when you can teach yourself, and informing your own representation of whatever it is that you see, also integrate ideas from other places. Maybe you do use the spreading of a disease to inspire your new machine learning algorithm. And that's accessible because you have raw access.
And when you were on the 3-month journey, did you have moments when you feel unmotivated or you were stuck in a concept or algorithm? How did you push through that challenge?
I think the most important thing is I set up a habit. So every day I would wake up and do textbook reading from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. Get up, walk to work, and textbooks for 3 hours. And in the face of that habit, there's a lot of mental clarity, because when you wake up, you don't have a lot of the fuzz that social interaction creates, and a lot of the distractions that come later in the day when you're sort of your life feels suffused with emails and other people's requirements. But also because I was doing the exact same thing every day. And this is Saturday, Sunday as well. So Monday through Sunday, 7 through 10, and I would track all of my time in detail. So I would map out exactly what I was doing, 100% time tracking. It meant that it was crystal clear to me what I was going to do. I would wake up, I would go learn it. And so regardless of whether I felt bad or felt good, I could rely on that habit being a source of consistency, and to make it so that it wasn't that I did it because I felt good. Oh, today I feel like learning. No. I had a very clear commitment to doing it every single day. And with this kind of method, I got through a book like the Deep Learning textbook in 2.5 to 3 weeks. So you read for maybe 15 to 20 days in a row, and you finish a textbook. And you have your own version of the textbook written in your own words, and you have implementations of the major algorithms in the textbook. And so it feels like you can put yourself through a pretty substantive course. But in this case, I was working every day, right? So this was done alongside a full-time job.
Yeah. And a lot of people today use like blog posts or YouTube videos or even tweets for learning. And you are a huge advocate for reading textbooks and rewriting the textbooks using your own language. So what are your thoughts about textbooks versus content created by other people?
Yeah, so the textbooks ran out for me, actually. So as soon as I got into research, academic papers, which were somewhat helpful, became relevant, but also all of the other informal tools, certainly social media and YouTube, became relevant because people don't really write textbooks about fields that are changing very quickly. And there is no textbook that I can reference right now to understand how to chain a body of meta prompts together in order to accomplish some complex knowledge work with a large language model. Actually, the deep learning textbook had a research section, which is mostly not relevant anymore. Kind of tragic. So it really was when I was learning things that are well mapped out that I could use textbooks. And the beauty of a textbook is that that content has been worked over by really bright people over and over again. It's robust, it's correct, and often there are answers to problems. So if you're solving problems, you can check whether you're right or wrong. And it retiles the way that I think. It's obvious that my language patterns, the way that I think about a topic, change, and the way that I speak about it change. I remember visiting long short-term memory, and after having read the deep learning textbook, being able to speak with the language of the research frontier and think with that as well. And so much of those concepts, take the memory cell as a novel concept, can be extended and can be used to be creative and can increase your conception of what's going on. I remember being fascinated while I was learning with this about optimization landscapes, and I would have dreams about these optimization landscapes. I'd be able to sort of see the gradients and the transitions in weight space. And there was something about global optimization that felt visual and visceral. And I was I was somewhat obsessed with this concept of optimization because it felt like humans were a result of an optimization process as well. And I would dream about the optimization landscape, the evolutionary process that created life was optimizing. And I would wonder what other points in space existed or how to more effectively navigate life space. So there's something about it becoming intuitive and being fun and actually having the thing that you're learning be a part of every single experience that you have of life, that made it feel almost like a worldview improvement as opposed to like a career move. It feels like the knowledge that's inside of them transforms who I am more than it just gives me a slightly higher salary or something like that.
Yeah. And let's talk about the 100-hour work week. So how many 100-hour work weeks have you done?
So this is a creative idea. I guess at this point, I have a little crew. So we have a 100-hour work week group, and people submit their proofs each day, showing that they're on their way. And the first thing I want to say about the 100-hour work weeks is they demand ikigai, this concept that you're doing something that's deeply aligned with your inner spirit. The society will reward you for doing it, but at the end of the day, you have to feel like it's fully aligned with like where you want to go and who you want to be. And if that level of alignment doesn't exist, I can't and would not endorse doing a 100-hour work week.
Yeah, you need a why for this effort.
Yeah, there needs to be a very, very deeply felt why to make it worth it. I think doing it out of necessity is quite dangerous. And I guess another major caveat, doing it with people or like with the support of the people around you is much better than doing it in violation of people. So make sure that your girlfriend, your wife, your your friends are aware of what's happening and ideally like supportive of it. Because it definitely puts a lot of pressure on everyone involved. But mostly I started the 100-hour work week as a way to launch my company's product. So actually at Omni, we are building this new kind of search engine. It's proactive, it works in your working environment, and it is deeply in touch with everything that you've written. So it's a kind of second brain. And I wanted to make sure that people would be able to use it. But I also was inspired by Nick Winter. Nick Winter has what's called the 120-hour work week. Okay. And so in comparison, I actually feel like
you're a slacker.
I'm a slacker. Yes, correct. Capable of a mere 100 hours. Yeah. And what a disappointment, actually. So he streamed his entire work week, and he has it up on his website. So if you Google 120-hour work week Nick Winter, you'll find it. This was all coding. So he was in the zone. And I think that flow states are pretty special. And if what you're doing is like flow state style activity, then it's not really that quote unquote painful to work a 100-hour work week. You are just obsessively acting in a direction that you really care about. And it's kind of hard to stop yourself from engaging with a project that feels incredible. So in my mind, that's the ideal structure for it, as opposed to being maximally pulled around by other people doing operational or social tasks, which in my mind would be a very painful 120-hour work week. Yeah. You just enter a very deep state of flow when you dream about the math you're doing or the code you're writing or the book that you're writing. And there's something about the purity of your lifestyle, the purity of the lifestyle, where by default what you do is progress in the most meaningful thing conceivable. And you have a very clear sense of purpose and are strident in your pursuit of that purpose. And upon realizing it, feel like you fundamentally transformed as a person. So the first 100-hour work week I went for was a transformative work week. It was meant to expand my conception of what I was capable of and have me put something into the world that was distinct from anything I'd ever put into the world. I had never launched a substantial product before. And having worked so long on it before, there's a deep and roiling sense of frustration. I've been fighting for this for so long, but it's not prepared, it's not ready. And something has to push me over the edge, right? And so I really tried to use it as a liminal experience and as a kind of peak experience. Yeah. And it definitely followed through. But yeah, it's non-trivial. So actually, you have to understand, in order to work on 100-hour work, you have to work at least 14 hours and 15 minutes-ish per day. And you do that every single day.
So how do you measure that?
Physically non-trivial.
Are you having like a clock to make sure you worked 14 hours that day?
So the thing that I discovered through Nick Winter was that streaming is very powerful. So I streamed it basically on
like on
my
Twitch?
Computer. No, so actually, there's a lot of private code and like communications, but the purpose of streaming is so that I am maximally efficient. It's terrible to do a 100-hour work week where you like spend time on Twitter or where you're putzing around in the background. And you want every single moment of the day to be a flow state or close to it, right? Yeah. And so the intention with streaming was to basically kill all pre-existing bad habits and create crystal clear proof that the entirety of the time had been spent productively pushing towards the mission as opposed to wasting my time. Yeah. And you'd be shocked at how much people are shocked when they start streaming at the fraction of their time which is not spent working in the way that they thought they were working. Yeah. So they'll record an 8-hour work week, or 8-hour work day, but in reality have worked maybe 2.5 hours because they were on Reddit, they were on YouTube, they were on Twitter, they walked around and took a break, they went to lunch for a long time. Right. So I did streaming and I did 100% time tracking. So every 15-minute interval has a specific task, and so my calendar is, instead of being full of things that I'm going to do, it's full of a detailed record of exactly what I did do in every 15-minute increment. And the streaming makes it easy to track that time as well. Yeah. Using streaming changed my psychology pretty deeply. I felt like I could see crystal clear proof of how productive I was being. And actually, as I watched myself working, I would become much more aware of my own productivity level. Yeah. Right. I don't know if you've ever watched yourself work, but there's something about the way your self-concept changes. So you are no longer you are like watching a person working, and that person can be more or less productive depending on I'm like the puppet master. You become capable of controlling yourself, right? So you're finally self-aware, you're finally in control of yourself on some level. And I actually think that the self-control problem is a deep problem. And most of our mechanism design, the reason we have these incentive structures in companies and in school and in every context where there's an institution is because we're trying to control our own behavior. Yeah. And this is a never-ending problem. It doesn't get solved by someone who has just like a single insight in a moment. The greatest entrepreneurs I know still constantly are deleting apps. So don't have complete self-control, right? But I think something that I romanticize about the 100-hour work week is that it is a kind of a proof that I have control over my own behavior. And I think that it's very easy to spend life out of control, feeling emotions that you that make you take actions that you don't agree with, being impulsive and doing things that are not aligned with your long-term estimation of what's worthwhile. And much like the marshmallow test, where the child decides, I'm not going to have the marshmallow now, I'm going to wait 5 minutes and then get a second marshmallow. The 100-hour work week is actually a very deep proof of self-control.
And I posted on LinkedIn, I asked my followers what they think about 100-hour work week. I think there's one interesting question I want to ask you. So someone said they found there to be a diminishing return on hours after working for, say, 40 hours or 50 hours. What was the incremental value of those 60 hours? Or do you feel tired after a certain point and you have to push through?
So I'm a huge fan of this book by Tim Ferriss called The 4-Hour Work Week. Actually, it inspired many of my ideas in lifestyle design. And the 4-hour work week is shockingly similar to the 100-hour work week in that they're both creative ideas, right? They're both asking, how can I understand the system or the process very deeply and make it work in the way that I want it to work? And so I'd say that the number 40 is a very strange number.
Like who decided it?
And I have a lot of creative ideas around it. Some have to do with when you should and shouldn't be working, but a lot of it has to do with the way that your life is industrialized and is really made into something that interacts well with society. Society is a very abstract concept. Interacts well with other people's schedules and other people's desires and demands and requirements and needs. And is an artifact of the need for predictability. So it's actually very important that the people around you be stable and predictable so that you can cooperate with them in a way that's predictable and stable. And those are objectives that don't always exist if you're, say, running a startup or if you're a researcher. And if you're not operating in those constraints, it's plausible that both the 4-hour work week and the 100-hour work week at different points in time and in life make much more sense than the 40-hour work week, week in and week out. Now, it's socially symbolic, right? So people have families and they need space. People have work-life distinctions that are very important to them because if they don't have them, their kids will overrun their ability to focus or their boss will run them into the ground. And both of these are horrific outcomes. And it's dangerous to talk about working hours because other people are watching you, and are creating their expectations of you and of the people around you based on what you do. And in my mind, outside of these societal incentives and constraints, people would naturally realize that, like, oh, I'm very obsessed with this project. I am happily working all of my hours to fulfill it. And that would be the case sometimes, and often they wouldn't be working at all. And so I guess there's a level of sort of functionality to all of these social rules. The deadline, all of these are very important for collectives to coordinate with each other, but are not the natural state of individuals. And I would like to the degree possible, construct my own incentives and live by them. I also have this idea. I feel the 40-hour work week, especially, say, the traditional 9 to 5, probably has formed since the days when people work in the factory or go farming, especially. You have to take advantage of the daytime. But a lot of people, they're more productive in the evening, and they want to get some enjoy the nature during the day. So why do we have to have this fixed 9 to 5? Why don't someone, maybe they want to go for a walk till noon and then they can do, say, 9 hours of work from 3 p.m. to midnight or something like that? I guess there's so many implicit assumptions in this as well. So if you are a capital owner, if you have an ownership stake in some organization, and people work at that organization and make it successful, you can often stop being a part of the organization yourself, keep your equity, and go do other things with almost all of your time. And one thing I noticed is that the people who I respected the most were often on multiple boards of multiple companies, but were not themselves employees. And I think that employee culture is in part maintained for a good reason, but by people who have strong incentives to sort of keep people in a 40-hour work week sort of style. But on some level is in my mind hard to justify as a lifelong lifestyle. And if you are convinced that you would design yourself a 40-hour work week day in and day out for the rest of your life as your ideal way of being in the world, tabula rasa, that is like without having access to all of the incentives that society uses to make you live that way, then by all means, like, enjoy the 40-hour work week. And if it's a functional choice for you, that I understand that too. Like, people have to be pragmatic. But I think there's a lot of risk aversion there. I think that people are not being particularly creative about how they work. For example, there are no companies that I know of right now where people work for 3 weeks and then take a week off. Or where people have summer break. So we give kids summer vacation, but it disappears as soon as you graduate. Where did it go? Why is it suddenly necessary that you work year round? And the intensities are also not there. So actually, when we were founding Omni, we had the sense of that hackathons were an incredible way to get tons of work done quickly. These would usually be 12-hour coding marathons for 2 days in a row. You get so much context on the code base that it would feel like you knew where everything was, right? So the speed at which I write code increases. Actually, you got, so yes, this question about efficiency. I submit that working 100-hour work week, the first time, gave me crystal clear powers over our code base that I would not have had otherwise. The sheer amount of context that you can fit into your mind if you have 2 15-hour days in a row in which you're interacting with every part of the code base is incredible. And for the next 5 days, you're going to be working with full contextual knowledge of where every single function and definition and variable and design assumption is, and the 4 places in your code base that you have to make a modification in order to implement a complex feature. You start seeing the interactions between the front end and the back end because you've interacted with every part of that code. There's something about the amount of context that you can fit in your brain simultaneously being the main bottleneck to creative action, where I could implement fully fledged features in 5 or 6 hours that would have taken me a week or more in a context where I wasn't able to load everything related to the feature into my brain and use it in order to implement something quickly. So I will submit that not only is it more productive to have a 100-hour work week if what you're doing is programming a complex system, but the peak performance, right? The complex level of the complexity of the features that you'll be able to implement increases. And it's categorically possible to do things that would not have been possible at your engineering level otherwise. And if you've not tried it, you don't actually realize how much your lack of context is affecting your ability to program well. And so, I'd call it a very special, somewhat irreplaceable experience that opened my mind to what I was capable of as an engineer. And I would say people should be in an experimental mode at least some of the time and should find out exactly what it's like to work in different ways. And it's totally fine to try the experiment and think, well, I get irritable or I'm tired or I'm physically just uncomfortable or whatever and I don't want to do it. But if you don't know, perhaps you should find out.
Right, find out your limit. So when you feel tired or your brain is like fried, what do you do during that time?
What was interesting is I started a group for doing 100-hour work weeks, and we had a lot of very similar symptoms, for lack of a better word. So some of it is actually very challenging. So one was physical. We would get tired, we would get exhausted, and then be irritable, emotionally irritable around like Thursday. So 3 or 4 days in, there was usually some anger and irritability. At day 6, usually there was some exhaustion. And not like sort of standard exhaustion, but the kind that comes from like not sleeping enough necessarily. There was a need to push through to the end, at least for me and a few others who were doing it. In those moments, it really was the novelty of the experiment and the curiosity about myself and how I would react to adversity that made it easier to push through. And I think that the struggle with doing these work weeks repeatedly, or even every other week, is that they start to feel more normalized, and your conception of what you're doing is clearer. And so I think it's harder. It's been slightly harder for me to use any novelty value to drive my motivation during most times. And my motivation becomes about other things, or my motivation is slipperier. And in my mind, that's okay. Like, in part, the purpose of this was to understand what it was like. Now, in general, when I'm tired and demotivated, I work on side projects.
Yeah.
Because they often do make me better at programming, but they don't feel onerous or painful. And so, yeah, often I'll implement something fun with my girlfriends. So, for example, last 100-hour work week, in the first 100-hour work week, we implemented a tool to send like cute images of dogs to your friends because we had generative models from DALL-E and Stable Diffusion, and we had generative text from DaVinci, and so it was possible to basically send really warm, caring messages using the Twilio API. And I had never deployed this kind of application to production, so I thought it'd be really fun to make it easy to send friends and family sort of like loving messages. And this was a side project, but it basically was something new and interesting, and it was not like directly related to my core work. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed it. So it was a great sort of reprieve from working on the exact same project all the time.
Yeah.
And it was certainly something that, and I actually started using Twilio on all of my work projects. So actually it clearly expanded what I could do in my core work as well. So yeah, continuing to work, but working on something which is a novel project, which you launch, but which is not something that you have to launch, feels like a really great response to getting tired.
Yeah. There's one part I really liked. You talked about kind of have a sense of curiosity once you feel your closer limit. I think that's a very interesting perspective. So sometimes when we wake up, we feel, oh, today we have this meeting I don't want to go to, or this task is so difficult. If you shift your kind of mental state into, hey, how am I going to take this as a little challenge for myself, or what I'm going to learn from this experience, or what kind of adventure I can have for a day like this, that will make you feel more positive or more excited about even like mundane, or whether it's a mundane task or a challenging task. Go ahead.
There's something deeply eye-opening about realizing what you are capable of in a 14 or 18-hour workday, in which in every single moment you are making direct progress towards your goal. It is astounding to just watch your design or watch your product transform in the course of a single day. And it is hard not to wake up with excitement if you are convinced that what you do in that day will expand your self-concept and will transform what it is that you're touching. And has there been days or moments when you are stuck by a bug? Maybe you're there for like 2 hours, you couldn't figure out. How do you overcome that plateau? Yeah, debugging. Debugging is actually a very real frustration, and it can be a major bottleneck where you're banging your head against something for hours sometimes and can't see exactly what's wrong. But I have to submit that during like the 100-hour work weeks, typically my awareness of what's causing bugs is enhanced. And the bugs that stop me, often bottleneck me for a week or more when I'm not working a 100-hour work week, can get resolved in mere minutes. And I'm not overstating that. Basically, code-based context lets you do hypothesis generation that can't be done if you don't have that context. So I know what's wrong in a much more accurate way, and I can fix what's wrong or test what's wrong in a much more subtle and intelligent way, because I know what's happening at every branch of the code. And the internal simulation debugging is in my mind, a big part of the debugging process. The diff between a senior engineer looking at some bug and a junior engineer is the senior engineer has been seeing error messages and has an intuition for what code has been running where, and so can pinpoint the 3 reasons that bug is possible and immediately check for 2 of them. And I entered that state during the 100-hour work week much more reliably than I am in it when I'm not doing a 100-hour work week. And so in many ways, there are a lot of bugs that I think it would have been very hard to solve if I could not create the level of insight that comes out of that context.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the beginning you worked on this because you want to launch your product. Can you tell us more about Omni?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we launched. The launch response was phenomenal. Hundreds of paying customers off the bat, and the use cases that we saw were pretty astounding. So a lawyer who picked us up realized that the research that he had done 2 years ago that he had totally forgotten about totally solved the problem that he was working on. So he found this brief. He had been in a place where he had to do days of research on the brief and actually suddenly was capable of, in his own words, describing what it is that he had to describe. Someone who basically uploaded all of their journals had a really emotional experience of using Omni, because as she typed about a breakup that she was thinking about, she saw every single breakup that she had had over the course of her history appear on the screen simultaneously.
Oh, wow.
In a proactive way.
Yeah.
And it was shocking to her just how much her brain had been blotting out these parts of her history.
Yeah.
And I think these memory systems are very ambiguous in some ways and very dangerous, because often there are things that it's important to forget.
Yeah. And also, like, sometimes I'll see like a photo of someone I'm not friend with pop up, like iPhone reminder, hey, this is the day you took a photo. I'm like, I'd rather not see that. I completely get it. Yeah.
And so we had an onboarding call where she realized that she had just told her boyfriend something that she had told her previous ex-boyfriends before they broke up with her. And she started crying in the onboarding call.
Oh, wow.
And I had no idea how to react to her seeing this version of her relationship history. And I think so it's very emotional. And I actually find this myself when I'm moving through all of my own ideas, that it's very easy to become fascinated with your own history through Omni. It's very powerful. But recently we've launched dataset powered generation. So for example, if I want to respond to a customer, all of our company's data is in an Omni dataset. And if I highlight their question and I click generate, it will search through the entirety of our company documents and put together a coherent response that links together the reality that's behind what's going on in the company for the customer. And in a lot of cases, this has just produced really phenomenal responses, or like long form writing or creative ideas. So when we were thinking about what new markets to hit, we gave it access to our company data, including descriptions of how the tool is used, and to describe how a number of legal use cases that we had never considered would be perfectly targeted by our search system and by our generation system. And so I think as a tool for basically doing messaging or understanding what's going on in a very general way at an organization where there's much more data than you can personally read, it's really just a fantastic tool. Where if you're trying to search for evidence of something and you're a lawyer, you can search through tens of thousands of documents effortlessly for the claim that we've been searching for, right? It's a very fast and effective tool. And the response was super surprising to me. I was just very happy, but immediately actually overwhelmed with a lot of ways in which our servers started breaking that I'd never seen before. So actually I had a kind of trial by fire, and it felt like I did this 100-hour work week and then did this huge launch. But if I did not also do an equivalent amount of work the next week, it wouldn't be possible to keep everything up and running, where our database was running out of space and the server load was overwhelming, and all sorts of bugs were discovered by customers that needed to be fixed very quickly. And the upload pipeline was sort of thick with different forms of customer data, some of it very large. There's so many issues actually that I had never dealt with. So for me, it was a very intense learning experience and pretty irreplaceable. There are a lot of things you can only learn by doing them.
Yeah. And what kind of data science or machine learning problem are you solving when building Omni? Like those business cases, what type of, data science problem does it translate into?
Yeah, it's mainly a search problem, but it's a novel kind of search problem because what we have is the context of your working environment. So we see what you've been writing, what you've been working on, and we also have access to your private data. So it might be data from the project where for the last 2 years you've had Zoom conversations and design documents and customer interviews, whatever it might be. And then we'll do proactive search. So one thing that convinced me to build this new company is when I was working on the web answers system at Google. This is a system that does question answering and then puts the answer at the top of your search results so that you can see the answer directly in your search experience instead of having to click through to one of the many documents that are lifted by the search engine and then read those documents to find your answer. And my realization was that if we can get the answer directly, there's no reason to go to a new web page and then do a search and then go to another new web page with the document of interest and then read that document and then find the answer and go back to your original working environment.
Yeah.
And so instead we try to put the answers in the working environment directly. And so this means building a relevance search system. So we started basically with this hierarchical semantic search engine, which uses re-ranking in order to improve the relevance of retrievals. So you have the level of documents, you have the level of passages, you have the level of sentences, and often we also consider multiple sentences as potential retrieval material. But we retrieve specific bits of content that are relevant to what you're reading or writing right now and are constantly triggered by the working environment that you're in. So we'll use the context of their page, your web page, your document, to inform the relevance search. And
so the recency
Google does
matters.
not have that kind of data. So the present matters, right? So currently you are working on writing a interview for a designer is one of the things I'm working on right now. And every interview you've designed for designers in the past can be shown to you in real time as you're working on it because we're in an extension that sees your working environment. So we can do that search with the context of your current web page in mind. Whereas if you go to Google and you Google interviewing designers, one, the content won't be the things that are relevant to your exact company, but two, Google doesn't know what you wrote in your existing doc. And so it can't tell you what you should say next or use that context in order to inform the search.
But I think Google does factor in the timing, like the recency.
Yeah, it's time for sure. But you're writing in your document about how to interview a designer is not in the Google search by default. That contextual information is usually really rich.
Yeah.
It has a lot of details about are you doing a coding interview? Are you doing an ethics interview? Like what kind of interview you're doing?
Yeah.
And it has your company context as well. It's like, oh, well, it's not a generic designer. It's a designer for a human-computer interaction tool that's using machine learning.
Right.
And all of those bits of information are challenging to give to a search engine in a really succinct way, even though in your browser, the knowledge is present.
Gotcha. And this seems to be a very kind of novel search problem. And do you have to construct your own metrics to evaluate how the model performs?
Yeah, so we do use some classic ranking metrics. But for the most part, the novel metrics are around proactivity. So we have to decide like when to retrieve. And the metric of user satisfaction or user happiness is an engagement metric that's specific to Omni, where we basically give you the ability to jump into the context of any document you discover from your working environment. And a lot of what we care about is, do you jump into that document and do you highlight from it? Do you copy paste from it? Like, what do you read inside of that document that's now open in your working environment? Because we'll jump you to the part of the document that is most relevant to whatever it is that you're reading or writing.
So not just a click in the top 3, top 5 search results. You also want to see whether they marked, highlight, copy, share those documents.
Do they basically pull an answer from the document, for example, and copy it into their working environment?
Okay, so some kind of engagement that's deeper than just click.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then do you do user research? How do you interview people, or how do you monitor people's behavior?
So we have an automated metrics suite, but we also do have user interviews where we'll, for example, talk one-on-one with a lawyer that's using us, and we'll ask questions about what kind of data they're using. So you basically have the ability to integrate with Drive or wherever your data is. You can add it to the system. And often a big question for us is, what exactly are they using us for? What is the use case? Are they doing brief writing? Are they doing evidence discovery? Are they interested in avoiding repeated work? So a lot of the applications are situations where someone's done some work before and they want to reuse it.
Yeah.
And we will proactively retrieve that work for them. So they have to do no work. They basically start doing it, and then they just copy in the pre-existing bit of work that solves their problem. And for a lot of people who are in repetitive jobs, it's a huge time saver.
Yeah.
And the interviews, typically, they cover the data that the person's using. They cover the UI and how they experience the UI. They cover the features and which features are working for them. We have a lot of in-context features, which are very different from most search engines. So our generations key in on the context of that user's personal data and of that person's working environment. So usually, like a highlight on the page is how we'll trigger some generative text. And so when you're writing with us, it really is about the existing writing that you have, as opposed to it being like a query to ChatGPT to create something totally new. And because everything is contextualized, often the generations feel like they're your own creative work. And so, personally, I like creating new words and new concepts for what I'm doing. And most of my generations will include my own creative works and thoughts and ideas in the solutions that are being generated.
Gotcha. So it's not just, for example, ChatGPT scrolling the entire internet. It's like a crowdsourcing. This one is searching through your own past, and also using the recency or metrics you mentioned. It can sort of detect what type of knowledge is obsolete, when to update. So the knowledge you retrieved is most relevant.
Yeah, exactly. So it incorporates our search system in the generation process. And the relevant search quality improves as users engage with it. So they jump into a document that they know is relevant to what they're doing. They copy some content in. We can see that and uprank that kind of retrieval. And now when some other user goes to perform the same task, the model will jump to the part of the document that was deemed by this other user to be relevant and will include it in the generative process so that the generative model knows about that particular bit of information or that context. And so we're basically training a relevant system that enhances ChatGPT style generations, but that customizes it in a very deep way to what you're currently doing at your organization.
You mentioned ChatGPT. Do you feel you will use kind of a similar interface that ChatGPT use, or also use some language model to fine-tune the search results?
So currently, we have a language model basically improving the results. We can do fine-tuning on your private data. And the fine-tuning isn't as helpful for factuality as using relevance search in order to improve the generations. We do have an appreciation for how ChatGPT lets you be in an interactive experience with the generated content. So if you're writing code and you want it to be from a library of interest or with a programming language of interest, you can correct the generation in order to do what you want it to do. And I think that interactivity is missing in most experiences of machine learning systems. In Google search, often you'll refine the search. And so you can see that process of refinement as being essential to most complicated tasks that can't be fully described in a single run. So we do have an interface that's a chat-like interface, which will be in any environment that you're working in, which will be contextually informed by all of your data, which will let you interact with the generative content and basically, much like chat, ask for refinements or like language changes or whatever you need. And I think this will also be essential to image generation too, which right now is very one shot.
Yeah.
You give an instruction and it creates an image, but eventually people will like layer segmentation over the image and let you describe, okay, now make him taller, or like make her hair blonde, or make the scene's background a dark scene instead of a light scene. And the model will basically adapt the generated content to whatever the refinement happens to be.
Yeah. And these days, the development of machine learning research is growing really fast. So what do you think about the future of machine learning, or maybe more specifically in the search space?
Yeah, it's actually phenomenal that there's been so much sort of new cohesion. So I'd say the Attention Is All You Need paper and the Transformer was the first major kind of convergence. And maybe you even see deep learning, conv nets, and LSTMs as being sort of convergence when it comes to sensory processing for machine learning. You see Attention Is All You Need is, okay, we converge on the transformer as the appropriate architecture for optimizing models in all of these domains. And you get phenomenal transfer where improvements in one domain effortlessly improve performance in another domain. And now we have an additional point of convergence around large language models, or very large scale training. And diffusion models and LLMs they're great examples of scaling up what is a really scalable architecture. And so the future of research in part makes it look like it's going to be possible to build incredibly high quality and complex models, which have outputs that can be chained to one another. So the language models will be able to generate outputs that themselves are prompts, or that themselves interact with the external world in a way that allows you to build very complex and interactive applications. So the model that generates a SQL query that collects the data, that means that you have to send a message to a particular person whose response tells the model that it should write its design doc in a particular way, whose write-up involves all of that contextual information, and then which is evaluated by a language model prompt that's been set up to do rubric generation, so that every aspect of the correctness and the creativity and the quality of the writing is evaluated to be very high quality, or if it's failing in some respect, a number of prompts are generated for the purpose of improving the quality of the writing until it's ready to be seen by a real person who will use it.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of the factfulness and evaluation problems will be solved and allow us to create really complex interactions between the generations that let us automate a huge fraction of existing knowledge work. And a lot of these projects I've seen and have worked on in various hackathons and with various friends, it's very clear that the research frontier is turning almost immediately into high quality products. And that's not just happening within an organization, it's happening industry wide. And OpenAI's research and Anthropic's research and a lot of these other orgs that are willing to create APIs to their models are making it clear that research is very impactful on real people's lives now.
Yeah. Do you feel it's easier or harder to get into deep learning or research?
Yeah, Silicon Valley is crazily accessible. I am impressed that so many people are open-minded about status and prestige and will basically act in a meritocratic way where if you build something of substance, they will talk to you. And if you go to other parts of the country, if you go to Boston and you try to get into a medical school without the appropriate requirements, or you try to go to a law school, they will be quite credentialist about your application process. And if you don't have an undergraduate degree, you will not get in the front door. Whereas, a lot of these organizations, like the absence of credentials from the system can even be an indicator of success. So the Teal Fellow that never graduated college is in higher standing on some level than the people who are too risk averse to attempt something of substance. And I think a lot of it actually is about risk aversion, where the Valley, for a very long time, since the gold rush, has rewarded people who come without clear credentials, but are willing to do something new and innovative and creative and take a lot of risk in doing it.
Yeah.
Upend their life, transform themselves in order to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a very special machine learning culture where people are accepted even if they haven't been blessed by the higher institutions that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something really attractive about that to me. There's something very real about it. And I think that it really is one of the greatest sources of the Valley's strength.
Yeah. And you left Google and started your company. What was the decision like?
Very painful. Golden handcuffs are very, very real.
Was real?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a lot to say about that. So Google creates a very high quality incentive structure so that you do not leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the way to quash competition by hiring anyone who might compete with you is actually an effective strategy. Plenty of the people who I would have wanted to bring on to build this kind of system with me were employed by Google and were uninterested in stepping down from their $500,000 a year salary.
Mm-hmm.
Reasonable on some level. And the golden handcuffs mean that there is much less competition than there would be in a natural sort of state of affairs. And I really am enthused by how many new institutions and new creative ideas will be executed in the wake of the layoffs, right? So never let a good crisis go to waste. The crises typically create opportunities, and those opportunities are things that would not have happened without the crisis, right? It's clear that having lots of people in crisis together is also better than having people independently in crisis, because the rejected can team up with one another and create something that could not have been built otherwise. So a part of me is very excited about that. But yeah, I left before all of this, and it was really hard and painful. I had to basically set up a situation where my entire society expected me to start this company in order to actually leave. And even then, actually leaving was very slow and somewhat excruciating. And
excruciating in what way?
So when you're considering leaving a very nice role, all of these excuses pile up. Your brain generates a lot of reasons you should do it. I don't know. I talked to Jeff Dean about building it internally. I was offered to create a team that would work on it as a part of Google. I had a lot of research interests as well, which were plausibly well done at Google. And I think that there's a part of me that has a lot of love for Google as an organization and as like a mission, and that felt like quite aligned with what they were doing, and I think that made it even harder to leave. But what made it easy is that there were so many internal betrayals of that mission that I felt leaving would be easier. And when I say betrayals, what I mean is people like not caring about knowledge or not caring about information or information access who worked there. And for me, someone who takes like learning and knowledge and growth very seriously, organizing the world's information is a kind of necessity. Is actually so I have a lot of knowledge structures for my own information, for my own knowledge, where I wrote what's called the index, this sort of total description of my worldview. Every domain in our society is mapped out in some level of detail. I like to try on some level to reinvent every major discipline, academic discipline and business discipline, in alignment with values that I care about. So I care a lot about this sort of organization of knowledge and acting on knowledge. And I think it's really impactful when you learn something new. And when we met, I was reading this book, Start With No, and I was reminded of like learning about BATNAs. This is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. This is a great example of a moment where learning about this concept allowed me to push for another job offer that I was not necessarily interested in. So I got an offer at Microsoft AI Research as well as at Google Brain. And then because I had great alternatives to negotiated agreements, allowed those offers to bounce and compete with one another. And that increased my salary by 150,000. So that was a big deal to like,
Yeah.
have that little bit of knowledge. So we live in a world where what you believe and what you determine almost all of your behavior. If you don't know machine learning exists, then it will be very hard for you to seek out the resources that will let you become a machine learning engineer or a researcher or a data scientist. Most people don't know what data science is when they get into college. They're not thinking about doing analytics in large companies. These are the things that they learn about and are taught over time. And so I think that the goals are very serious. It's an offense to me that college students aren't given a comprehensive introduction to the research frontiers of every major technical discipline when they walk in the front door. And often they go through their entire career not knowing what alternatives existed, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just want to say I'm very aligned with the overall thesis, and Omni has a very similar bent. It's the idea that all knowledge and all information should be in your working environment when you need it. And I think it's a huge opportunity to change the way that learning works, to integrate learning into every action, as opposed to making learning into something you do in school with books. Much more like Civilization, where you play a video game that exposes you to every aspect of history, and you can be fascinated by it, but it's also fun, right? So you hit the practical side of things. You accomplish your knowledge work more effectively, but you also learn the relevant context to that work in a very natural way. So yeah, I also have to say, I was very aligned with the fundamental mission at Google. But I had I had a few, I think, golden handcuff type experiences, which made me generate excuses, which made it feel painful.
Yeah. And now looking back, do you feel you left at the right time? Do you wish you could leave earlier or learn more and then leave?
Yeah, it was maybe a few months early, but it was not off by much.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think the reason I say that is Omni is buildable because the quality of language representation and the internals of these transformer models makes proactive search accessible to a small organization without large pre-existing infrastructure for training incredibly large models on billions of data points of customer data. And in the absence of that technical capability, delivering the experiences that we're delivering to our customers would not be feasible.
Yeah.
And so, I want to say something along the lines of maybe 3 or 4 months early, but that's it.
Previously, you were working on a lot of machine learning research as a data scientist, and now building a company, you become a full stack engineer. So what was the shift from the kind of data science world to the engineering world?
I learned more in 2 months than I had learned in what feels like the entirety of my time at Google. So there are so many aspects of the stack that I did not realize existed, actually. And it was a fantastic working experience with my co-founder as well, where we both discovered how to create extensions, how to be aware of what's happening in the browser, how to maintain that state and use it effectively, how to feed data to algorithms. The complexity of our database usage was just much, much higher than anything I dealt with. The optimization for speed, from like database indexing to latency minimization by placing our servers in the appropriate places. All of these things are not things I had been familiar with. I guess I was also kind of overwhelmed by the sheer number of libraries that I was using effectively without fully understanding them. And it's clear to me now that there are so many kinds of software engineer. I did not feel before this project like I was what I would have called a real software engineer in my head, even after building this sort of distributed deep learning training system on Spark, right? In my head, real software engineers write in C or C++, and they write operating systems or compilers. And I was not an OS or compilers nerd, and I felt like I didn't have access to that. And I think that the classic data scientist, whose primary working environment is a Jupyter notebook, typically feels a kind of displacement from the rest of the software engineering community. And perhaps rightfully so. Like, environment management and server management are different skills,
Yeah,
very different
hate
skills. Yeah, yeah.
I know
Yeah,
it's
say more about
useful, but I have to kind of convince myself I need to learn those type of things because it's useful. I'm limiting myself if I only focus on the algorithm, the data science part of it. And I think a lot of data scientists also feel this way. It's like I want to work on what I'm interested in and what I'm good at. And some people hesitant to learn more engineering skills. So what do you think about?
It's shocking to me how closed-minded people become
Yeah.
as soon as they are profitably employed in something. And to most people, it would be shocking that someone could go 15 years or 20 years in industry and never learn
Yeah.
to manage servers, or never learn to set up a database, and never learn how to distribute an important computation across the cluster. And the reason they never learn these things is they're ensconced in an incentive structure that often actively disincentivizes reaching outside of your domain of expertise. And typically the trajectory is from breadth to more and more specificity in what's done. And you end up knowing a particular company's stack. So I actually, I remember when I was at Google trying to work with open source libraries, it being so painful to convince them to let basic libraries into Google 3. And if the reasons like security, it's tricky, but basically Google lives in its own world. It has its own infrastructure. It has a TPU. It uses TensorFlow, not PyTorch. And this is the case for almost every major like technical domain. The Cider and Code Search and a lot of these tools are phenomenal tools. But yeah, you end up with a skill set that is company specific.
Yeah.
And there's so many basic things that I had no idea how to do.
Yeah.
That are in retrospect really sad, because I could have been for my entire life building and launching products for fun,
Right.
and I was just totally incapable of a basic thing like server setup and deployment, and setting up a dev prod environment, and like basic front end skills like basic JavaScript that lets you create an experience that a user won't totally hate interacting with. And you could see this in the first version of our product. It was before I'd hired our designer, and we created an interface that looked like it was from the 2000s or like 1990s, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think as a researcher, there's no reason that you will push yourself to a point where you learn what I think are skills that change your decisions. It's in part scary or unthinkable to build a company instead of working on your data science work, because you don't know what it will involve and don't have the skills that are required. And so, yeah, part of me feels like there's a collective tragedy where people end up ensconced in safe places and stop growing. I'm sure you've heard of this sense that like adults can't learn languages. And there are a few studies that showed that actually adults can learn languages very well if they've recently learned a new language. They become like children again.
Yeah.
And what that made me think was that we are actually incredible learners throughout life. But we live in a society where you get tracked into something very narrow and specific in which you're not incentivized to learn anymore.
Yeah.
And you turn your learning mechanism off. And so it's really clear to me that a lot of the skills that you're afraid of could be learned by you in 2 or 3 hours in an afternoon. And if you learned them, it would change your conception of what you are capable of. There would be specific changes in your conception of what you can build, but then there would be identity level changes in who you are, where a lot of these job titles get internalized as identities. And if you're a data scientist, you need to be working on something mathematical and something algorithmic, on something statistically sophisticated. And if you don't, you will lose prestige. You will perhaps be asked at your company to work on data engineering tasks, right? There's a curse. I remember, it's horrifying for me to say this now, but I remember determinedly not learning SQL because I did not want to become like the SQL monkeys. That's how my Harvard friends describe them, the SQL monkeys that form the data engineering infrastructure at companies in the Bay. I didn't learn it on purpose. And that's a tragedy when you feel like a clear understanding of your incentive structure means that if you gain a skill, your boss will force you to use that skill.
Yeah.
And you carefully hide your knowledge. I remember a friend of mine has knowledge of a part of Spark's internals, and she would refuse to submit PRs publicly to that subset of the code base because she knew that if she submitted those PRs, people would realize that she understood how it worked.
Yeah.
And they would ask her to do code reviews for people submitting to that subset of the code base, and she did not enjoy it, right? So I think it's tragic that people either maintain ignorance willfully or hide their competence from others so that they can continue to do what they want to do. And the data scientist, I think, is in a great place of often doing what they want to be doing. Yeah. And they want to keep it that way.
Yeah.
So I think that a lot of this fear is built into our incentive structures. And if we were in a different incentive structure, if you're building a company and it's essential that you learn something new, you go and learn it immediately. And you end up on a much faster learning curve because you've abandoned the degenerate incentives that basically cast you into a position where learning was damaging to you.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And also a lot of data scientists feel, oh, we didn't learn computer science in school, and then they feel other people spent 4 years learning this. It's not something I can pick up immediately. I really resonate with the experience because I had a lot of fear about just trying. I didn't even Google. I didn't even try to learn. And then only happened when some deadline I had to meet and I had to learn. Then I realized, oh, I could have done this like a year ago. And then those experiences make you feel more confident and capable. And the next time when you run into something, okay, last time I did this, so I don't know how this worked, but I believe I can learn this.
And then you think of all the things you're not learning right now.
Yeah.
Due to some limiting belief.
Yeah.
No, that's so real. So I actually had to relearn from friends that I was able to teach myself things. Like I needed social proof.
Yeah.
And what's horrifying is to know something is true about your own learning process and not feel the belief in it until someone who you respect walks up and tells you the truth.
Yeah.
Gives you your own insight, but in their words. And suddenly it feels true enough to you that you can act on it. And becoming that voice for yourself is an essential part of growth.
Yeah, because sometimes people looking at the news, they wait to see someone looks like them or have similar experience to achieve something, so they feel inspired. If you always wait for other people to inspire you, that might be too late for you to embark your own journey. Yeah,
I actually was stunned. So Ray Dalio, the creator of Bridgewater, was this person for me, where there were phenomenal ideas in cognitive biases that I could sort of watch myself confirmation biasing, believing things that were true because I wanted them to be believed, or I could experience my own time discounting, where I felt like the present was more important than the future. And I was horrified by it. But when I read someone who told me so many clear and concrete truths about my mind, I didn't trust them. I didn't believe that what they were saying was true until Ray Dalio, the creator of Bridgewater, the most successful macro trading hedge fund that exists, said the exact same thing that this really brilliant person had written. So here I talk about Yudkowsky's sequences. Comes in with the exact same ideas and principles, but backed by the social proof of somebody who has been sort of at the top of the financial hierarchy. And I felt offended at my own judgment and disbelief in something that my own mind could see was the truth, but that I couldn't believe it until someone of sufficient standing had repeated those words. And there's so many ways in which I was not believing my own thoughts, even though they were crystal clear and logical, and I could follow the paths. And so I think there's something about an independence of mind that has to be sort of catered to as a personality trait. Or so Ralph Waldo Emerson has this book called Self-Reliance, and it was an inspiration to me. I almost quoted it a bit a moment ago. And this book is really about listening to your internal source of truth and
Right.
believing it, really believing it.
Yeah.
And I think so much of creative action comes out of believing that the things that you think and perceive are true, and you are willing to act on them even if there's no external social proof for what it was that you were seeing. And if you don't, then you have to accept your creative idea from some other person who's executed on it.
Yeah.
Much like the person who came up with the great company idea but never decided to implement it has to use the service of, I have a lot of customers like this, has to use the service of somebody who had enough conviction to actually implement it. And I think the lesson there is about becoming an independently minded actor as opposed to just thinking. There's something there about creative action, and a part of me wants to find a way to complete my own belief in the thoughts that I can see as being clearly correct.
Yeah. I think it's really important, especially with social media. You're basically in this echo chamber. It's important to be an independent thinker and be in tune of your own intuition. But there are times when other people give us feedback, which is they tell us our blind spot. So how do you decide when to take that feedback or when to ignore that feedback and follow your own intuition?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, like being very close to people who have very different traits than I do has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
So, I try to right now work with people or like be emotionally close to people who basically invert all of my weaknesses.
Oh, okay.
So I am a hyper optimist who believes I'm capable of anything.
Yeah.
And this leads me to becoming overcommitted very easily. I'll think, oh, of course I can say yes to everybody and fulfill all of their requirements. But actually, this leads to overcommitment. And so being around someone who's like very grounded around what it takes to maintain focus and around the limits of personal capacity has been really helpful and important to me. But usually you get feedback from reality too.
Yeah.
So your projects struggle or fail, and you, upon looking at what patterns exist in the struggles that your projects have, see patterns. And it's not enough to see the patterns. So I think it's really tragic that it's easy to know what your failure mode is likely to be, to sort of hear your doom, even if it's hear it escape the words of someone you trust and you believe that they're correct, but still feel like it's unlikely that you'll be able to do anything to overcome it. I think if there are a lot of deep set weaknesses, there has to be a really core and intense process of creating cognitive dissonance so that you stop believing the thing that led to the weakness. So I guess to be concrete, act in alignment with what you think that your challenge or your struggle is. So I guess my example is actually deciding to study applied math. I had a lot of experiences early on with math where I was good in it, but weaker than in the rest of my subjects. In the rest of my subjects, I was phenomenal. In math, I felt limited.
Yeah.
And I majored in it in college. And
because you weren't good at it.
Yes. Well, and in part because I felt upstream of all other learnings as well, but in part because, I got a 5 on all of the English and history AP tests, even the AP statistics. But in Calc BC, Calc AB, I got 4s, and those stung very painfully. And as someone who prided himself on autodidactic learning, I couldn't really bring myself to self-study calculus to a degree that would make me feel like I was competitive. Like there were all these courses at Harvard, like Math 55, which were being taken by people around me, and I felt like clearly inferior, and that was super painful.
Yeah.
And so, I basically set out to correct for my weakness, and it feels like boosting. So in this decision tree algorithm, you upweight the data points so that your model performs poorly on, so that they're more likely to be classified correctly on the next iteration. And you measure the residual, the difference between your performance on them and their actual value, to decide how heavily to weight them. Yeah. So I did a kind of personal boosting, where I took the things that I was supposedly weak at and centered them in my focus, to basically make sure that I would be capable when I graduated of learning any domain independently, because it was clear that there were strong limits to what you could become if you were incapable of, say, like learning some new mathematics required to do some research.
And for other folks who also want to learn machine learning on their own, what are some of your advice?
Well, it's a wonderful time, certainly, to do it. I think my major bit of advice is that you will make it if you continue to knock. If you take yourself seriously and you make genuine effort day in and day out, invariably you will actually end up being able to work professionally in a space. It's very, very weakly limited by intelligence. You're almost certainly, if you're listening to this, more than intelligent enough to do it. And people have all sorts of strange conceptions of what they can and can't learn that they take from what I call degenerate institutions. So school doesn't really teach you how to teach yourself effectively.
No.
And being an autodidact, someone who teaches themselves, is central to a community I started called Inspired Autodidacts, where the intention is to free yourself from the strictures of college life and the ontologies that these academics have set up about the disciplines and what it does and does not exist. Because if you're interested in field founding, or if you want to create something fundamentally new or never seen before, you'll need to typically integrate a body of ideas that have never been integrated before. And by teaching yourself, in school, typically, if you want to do a PhD, you're limited to a single domain. If you wanted to learn multiple domains in depth, you would have to take it upon yourself. And I know, I see like Stephen Wolfram as a great example of somebody who like robustly teaches themselves new fields very quickly, communes with people in those fields, and then uses them in Wolfram Alpha or write a book on metamathematics or to do whatever it is that he thinks is most worthwhile, integrating the ideas in some theory of everything. And a lot of the learning that comes out is just through self-teaching. There's no degree program that he enrolls in with a professor with a long storied history in the space. And then, sort of a process of having a course where everything is set out for him and the incentive structure is created so that he's forced to learn by a grading system. No, rather the idea behind it, autodidacting is you should be able to create your own incentive structure. Do socio-financial accountability where you bet your friend whether or not you'll be able to pass a test, or where you have a group that record that every single day. Did you or did you not complete your textbook writing? And show me the algorithm you told me you would show me a week ago. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these institutions, school, work, etc., are just bodies of people that agree to do something together.
Right.
And humans are wired in that way. So certainly I would advise people to take it upon themselves to self-organize their friends in a way that lets them learn what's most important to them. So many people want to learn machine learning. You certainly can get a lot out of learning from other people and using them to give you the motivation you need that you would ordinarily have gotten from school or from a career. And it's actually up to you. You can do it today. You can send a message right now.
When we go to school, exactly like you said, it's like a construct we're used to, and it's also psychologically make you feel already investing a lot of money. I need
cognitive dissonance.
I need to study harder. Or you can give your friends $10,000 and to hold you accountable to have your own curriculum and learn.
I do have some plans. I usually call them operations. So actually, when I have an operation, often I will make a number of thousands of dollars commitment. So I think in my favorite operation, I had a $17,000 commitment overall to every goal that was listed in this 3-month body of goals with measurable outcomes and which were very specific. And it's pretty intense. And I think that accountability can be really helpful to deal with a lot of the cognitive biases that will crop up when you're trying to do something hard. By default, your body does not want to do something hard.
No.
It wants to rest and relax and hang out and chill. And if you have a clear conception of who you would become in the face of a genuine commitment, and you can conceive of a structure that makes that happen, in my mind, this is far superior to subjecting yourself to a different kind of coercive system,
Yeah.
right? So work and employment will put money behind your actions. School will put grades and future money and reputation behind your actions. Research will put citations behind your actions. And these incentive structures are not particularly flexible. So if you get good at creating them for yourself, you can become something that the economy does not naturally incentivize you to become, where you see most identities as being downstream of the day in and day out processes that they go through every day. Turning up to work as a data scientist trains you to think and feel a particular way. But there's so many ways of being in the world that are only maintainable if you create the incentive structure that generates that identity. If you create the training data set, if you will, the set of experiences and behaviors that let you live out a creative conception of yourself. And so I think it's critical to take the incentive structure in your own hands, design the mechanism, and in designing it, design yourself.
So now looking back at your career, what are something you wish you could have done more when you were younger?
So I think the concept of career is very dangerous. I don't conceive of myself as having a career.
Yeah.
I have a life mission and I have values, and I work on projects that are aligned with the fulfillment of everything that it is that I care about. And so the career concepts feel like vaguely offensive. I'm interested in missionary behavior. And whatever it is that I'll do will be in the style of a missionary who deeply believes in what it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
And who's mostly sacrificing for the mission, right? So when I get money, it does feel like the money's purpose isn't so much to enhance my personal life as it is a war chest for fighting for something that I think is deeply worthwhile in the world. And I'll make intense financial sacrifices in order to realize values that I want to see expressed more often in the world, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, changes to my early life behavior. I mean, yeah, I feel really blessed, honestly. I think that when I was 9, encountering a teacher who would let me read the encyclopedia in class instead of doing worksheets was totally transformative. And those reads gave me a sense for history and for the breadth of human potential that would not have existed otherwise. Certainly in high school, self-studying all of these AP tests let me get into Harvard and Yale and Princeton and MIT and Stanford. And these schools are relatively exclusive and hard to access. So I had it etched into me that autodidacting and self-learning was a path to extreme success, and that's certainly served me well. Now, apparently I still can go farther, right? So there's so many examples of people waking me up to my own understanding of what it is that I'm capable of intellectually. And I appreciate that. One thing that I do wish I'd done much earlier, though, was taking company creation seriously. So when I was at the Harvard Innovation Lab, I tried to start a time tracking company. And the intention was to do 100% time tracking, so 24 hours a day, where you were and what you were doing. It was a form of self-awareness, really. Like the deeper frame for it is, I want to know who I am as a function of what I do. And immediately you'll see who you're with and who you spend time with. And the way that your values translate into what you spend time on is something I really wanted to sort of refine. So I wanted to know that my life was well aligned with what I cared about. And as soon as I started time tracking for the first time, following a Randy Pausch lecture, it became painfully obvious to me that my conception of what I wanted for myself and for the world and how I was acting were totally misaligned. Not totally, we're extremely misaligned with one another. And I wanted to bring that into alignment. But I would feel like that first attempt at starting a company was unserious. Unserious in the sense that my co-founder and I built this iOS app. He did most of the programming, I did much of the design and the ideation. And the app worked. It was actually a more effective way to track your time on your phone. Where you would pinch and expand to record an event, and you had a record of all of the popular events in your calendar, so you could very seamlessly track. And the product was actually, in retrospect, great. And this is something that still doesn't exist and that I desperately want to be using. And it's automation where it, looks at where you are and uses that to make an assumption about what you're doing. Or has your browser history, much like rescue time, and automatically records that on a calendar. That functionality is still incredibly valuable. but I did not take it seriously as a project. Like I didn't push the product to launch with lots of users. I didn't pitch the product to every accelerator and every venture capitalist I could find. I planned to go back to school and finish my mathematics degree instead of being open to the possibility of continuing with the project after the summer. I was too obsessed with becoming great at Ultimate Frisbee than with becoming great at company founding.
Yeah.
And I think if I had taken it seriously, I would have taught myself what I needed to continue to improve the product. And I also would have pushed myself in terms of very pragmatic leadership, where being a part of managing a team that was accomplishing the goal would have been a very early experience. And I would have pushed myself to fundraise and learn how to fundraise. And I guess on so many other axes, consider the financial consequences of what I was doing for myself. I was unserious. And if it had been done seriously, like if someone convinced me like, oh yeah, like this is real, you should go all the way, you should sacrifice for it, it plausibly would have taken off. And so I think, my big regret is not pushing my self-concept early on with that project. And it's clear when I think about how I'm going to raise my children that they will be clear on what they're capable of very early in life, and they will be capable of learning very early in life as well. And so I think the thing, I wish my father or mother had put me through is to show me the world, right? So Aladdin has this music, I can show you the world. Dazzling, right? There's a dazzling world, even just intellectually. So if you go through every major research frontier that exists, take a comprehensive map of every technical discipline. It's like mathematics, physics, biology, chemistry, electrical engineering, computer science, biomedical science, all of mechanical engineering. These disciplines all have research subfields. Some of them fascinating, from algebraic geometry to mean field theory. Machine learning and artificial intelligence was really unusual back in 2014 when I was becoming obsessed with it. It's so easy to not know what exists. So the one thing I wish had happened is that I had been taught that, one, it's possible to create everything that exists in this world. There's this very famous Steve Jobs quote about how everything that you experience in the world was created by someone who is just like you. And I think that also there's a deeper version of the quote, which is, you can create it and here's how, right? And I would like part of my upbringing to have been, here's how to create almost everything that human civilization has made. Everything from making the concrete required to create skyscrapers to the founding of civilizations and how to start a new country, start a new religion, start everything that we see as being civilization and what life is about. And the only thing that gave me some insight into that was playing this video game, Civilization. But ideally, there would have been a real world version of it where in some small way, I was made to create everything that would give me the foundational knowledge around how to basically become or create whatever it is that I wanted in life.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen. Instead, I read a lot of books and played video games.
And now, how do you see yourself grow in the future?
I guess I spent the last 2 years in really immense action, decisive action, day in and day out. And I do want to re-expand my intellectual life. So a few years ago, I was writing a lot. I wrote a lot of posts. I had written this huge manuscript on abstraction and the structure of information. I had a really novel research frontier in machine learning, which was a totally new sort of redesign of how to do machine learning.
Yeah.
So I wanted to attack the field at its foundations. And so I started using functional data analysis, basically treating functions as data and having algorithms represent functions and put functions in embedding spaces and move through those embedding spaces in order to search through functional space as a sort of deep reframe on machine learning. So part of me feels like I never fully fleshed out a lot of these ideas. And so to the degree that I have space, I really want to work on them. But Yeah, I think at present I really want omniscience to take off and have my company succeed. There's so much potential in a lot of the algorithms that we're working on, doing long form text generation, decomposing arbitrary forms of knowledge work into their subtasks and automating those subtasks. The intent is to rewrite the internet, basically personalize everything that you read, making sure that it knows and understands what and frames everything in a way that's emotionally engaging to you, right?
Yeah.
To start taking actions in the working environment and not just showing search results,
Right.
where when we predict what you're about to do with really high probability, that just happens automatically, and where the version of that feature turns into the automation of the knowledge work that you're working on. And there's substrate independence. So as brain-computer interfaces take off, being able to give people the experience of knowing whatever it is that they need to know in the moment that they need to know it is certainly a step change in what it's like to be human.
Yeah.
And where the research processes that I was engaged in can be automated by complexes of prompts using large language models and using search and SQL and eventually experimental automation and code-based rewriting. And where a lot of these tools, when turned into products and taken to their maximum, fundamentally change what it's possible for us to do as a species. So the future on that front is really, really glorious and brilliant. There are a lot of things that I've always wanted to do, like computational physics. Right?
Yeah.
So if I was ever to do a PhD, it would be in what I've been loosely calling informationalism, but where people like Seth Lloyd, this researcher at MIT working on quantum computing, who has a book called Programming the Universe, describing the way that a high-quality quantum simulator can replicate important parts of how physics works, to Wolfram-style cellular automata, like originally an idea from, the name of the genius escapes me, the founder of game theory, John von Neumann. Originally an idea from von Neumann, who created the von Neumann architecture that we all use. These cellular automata have emergent properties that replicate the laws of physics. Gregory Chaitin, who works on information theory, a lot of these ideas and how information is the fundamental substrate of the nature of our reality, which when taken to an engineering mindset, let us ask questions about how to generate worlds or generate realities much like ours, given sufficient compute. And so I think one major branch of research in physics that should exist but does not should be proactively executing on the highest quality simulations that we can execute on, whether it be a cellular automata or a quantum computer, or Schmidhuber talks about algorithmic theories of everything and sort of finding our laws of physics as a point in the space of possible theories of everything. And I think this would be a very interesting PhD, was sort of working to found a new field like this.
Yeah, that sounds like a very exciting future. And I don't know if the audience can see it. You're wearing a very interesting suit with all the mathematical formulas there. And this is a very interesting conversation. And if people are interested in like reading your blogs or reaching out to you, where can they find you on the internet?
So my blog lives online at jeremynixon.github.io, and I'm on Twitter at jvnixon. And at both places you'll find tremendous amounts of intellectual content, actually. So please do say hi.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.